Hey guys, I'm going to do some notes for you again today. Today we're talking about powers of the presidency, specifically the non-executive powers of the presidency. He is our chief executive, but he does have powers that are far past what an executive would do. So we're going to look at a few of those today. We're going to start with his diplomatic powers. Treaties. Treaty is a formal agreement between two sovereign states, whether it is the United States and Great Britain, United States and Germany, United States and Russia in this case. It is this formal agreement that is signed by both. Now, to be a treaty, it's something that the Senate must approve of. This is in the Constitution. It states in the Constitution that the Senate must advise and consent, and it's at a 2/3 approval. If you remember your ninth grade history at all, the Treaty of Versailles was never adopted by the U.S. Senate, so we actually wound up signing treaties with each country individually over the course of the next several years. As Secretary of State, the President may send that individual to act as a proxy, somebody to stand in for him in that role. An executive agreement is sort of like a treaty. The big difference is what you see right here. It does not require Senate consent. So in this way, it's similar to an executive order. If you remember from our previous lessons this week, an executive order is like a law that doesn't go through Congress. An executive agreement is like a treaty. It's a pact between a president and the leader of a foreign state. So whether it's the Prime Minister of Canada or if it is the Chancellor of Germany, and they come to an agreement. Again, your ninth grade history, you may have learned about the Gentleman's Agreement. This was an executive agreement between President Theodore Roosevelt and the head of state of Japan at that time regarding segregated schools in San Francisco. It did not go through Congress. It will usually have some sort of law basis to it, even though it does not go through Congress. Another example would be the Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940. We weren't involved in World War II yet. We didn't want to be involved. So what we did was we kind of made an executive agreement. President Franklin Roosevelt this time said, all right, we're going to sell you these overage warships that were perfectly fine and usable if you just give us some naval and air bases throughout the Atlantic. And really, it was a matter to defend against the German war machine, but it worked as just a regular agreement. The president will also receive foreign heads of state. You'll see state dinners, usually in the East Room of the White House, where it will be a lavish affair, black tie affair, or it may just be for a smaller meeting. There's a hilarious example of Boris Yeltsin, the head of the newly formed Russian Federation, coming and meeting with President Bill Clinton. He also may legally recognize a state. Harry Truman, very famously, when Israel became a state, he recognized it as such, and in doing so, the rest of the world kind of agreed so as well. Now, there obviously are complications with the state of Israel, always have been, but by the president recognizing it as a state, it legitimized it as a state through the eyes of most of the world. Now, all this has nothing to do with approving of a nation's actions. You can believe that something exists, you can acknowledge that it exists, you can interact with it without necessarily approving of everything. China's human rights violations, Iran's human rights violations, we can still interact with them and acknowledge them as a sovereign state without necessarily agreeing with everything they do. And that goes both ways. So, military powers. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military. Now, he cannot declare war. That is in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which is the powers granted to Congress. Congress alone has the power to declare war. And anytime the president gets involved in that, like Woodrow Wilson in 1917 or Franklin Roosevelt in 1941, he is addressing Congress, requesting them to declare war. These are very famous speeches that were made by the president asking Congress to do something that he himself is unable to do. That said, the president has a lot of power over the military. For example, Theodore Roosevelt, he sent the entire U.S. Navy around the world just as a show of force. Hey, look at our Navy. Look how powerful it is. He has final authority and ultimate responsibility over the U.S. military. This is a power that has been expanded as we get involved in more and more conflicts throughout our existence, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with President Johnson leading to a troop surge in Vietnam, or if it was the efforts following September 11th with President Bush sending troops into Afghanistan and then eventually Iraq. And we have many, many undeclared wars. Most U.S. presidents have used troops in force even without there being formal declarations of war. There is a very few number of years in the U.S. history's existence in which we don't have soldiers abroad securing peace or fighting. John Adams sent the Navy to battle French warships in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison sent the Marines and the Navy to fight Barbary pirates on the northern coast of Africa, Korea, Vietnam, Panama, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq. All of these are not declared wars. And yes, I did say Iraq twice. That was intentional. Legislative powers. We've talked about separation of powers, yet the president has a lot of legislative power. First of all, he can recommend legislation. He is a major push for certain packages to be passed. The most notable example is probably Obamacare. That was passed while Obama was president, not while he was in the legislature. It is named for him because it was a bill he and his team pushed for. So the president is allowed to recommend legislation, just like you, a citizen of the United States, just like the president is, are allowed to recommend legislation. Obviously, he has a little bit more sway, but he still has that power. He also is supposed to give 3 messages to Congress during a year: the State of the Union address, a budget report, and an economic report. The State of the Union is the big fancy one that has all of the government together and is a major production. And messages are sent at any given time. This is important. It seems simple, but it's important because if this wasn't permitted in the Constitution, Congress could prevent the president from interacting with them. And their separation of powers becomes a major problem because now there is no interaction between powers. He also has the veto power. We've talked about this before. The president can veto or reject a bill. This is a 2/3 majority to be overturned by both houses. So it isn't usually common for a veto to be overturned, but the president can say, I refuse to allow this to go into law, and veto it. FDR has 635 vetoes across his 12 plus years of being president. Only 9 of those were overturned. So overturning a veto is uncommon. And in fact, just the threat of a veto is enough to kill a bill often. There's this concept called a line item veto. It's where for specific spending bills, the president can just cross out certain aspects of a bill rather than rejecting the entire bill, just small pieces. This was something that was sought for since the days of Ulysses S. Grant, but it was believed that it was giving the president too much power. The Line Item Veto Act in 1996 did allow for this, but it was then declared unconstitutional in 1998. So it didn't last very long. It would have to be something that would be added to the Constitution in an amendment for the president to have this power. All right, judicial powers. These are very much in the news right now because the main judicial power the president holds is the power of clemency. The idea that he can pardon somebody of federal crimes. Now, one thing is he has no authority over state crimes. That is a state's governor that can do that. That is the federalism separation that we learned about early in the year. But a pardon is a legal forgiveness of that crime to the point where the conviction is taken away. It can be granted after conviction takes place, but before sentencing. It can be granted after years in prison, or it could even be granted before a trial or even charges are filed. President Gerald Ford pardoned former President Nixon of any and all crimes. This was done in a motion to move past Watergate, to try to put an end to what he called our long national nightmare. And it really hurt him politically at the time. Historically, people look back and say it's the right decision for the country, but it was a terrible decision for Ford, the politician. Clemency. Continued. Commutation. This is reducing of a sentence. So the individual is still convicted of that crime. It still will be on their record, that federal offense, but they may no longer have to serve prison time, or maybe instead of the death penalty, it's reduced to life without parole. Instead of life without parole, it's reduced to life or 30 to life with a possibility of parole, something like that. An example would be Scooter Libby, who was the advisor to former Vice President Cheney. As George W. Bush is leaving office, Vice President Cheney is really pushing to get Scooter Libby a pardon, a full pardon. And George W. Bush eventually decides, I'm only going to commute his sentence. I'm going to take away the jail time, but he has to pay the fine. He has to have the community service, and most notably, the conviction stands. And I bring up the fact that it was as George W. Bush was leaving office because many, many times a president, any president, will do their most controversial pardons as they are leaving office. This is a very common thing. Both sides of the aisle have been known to do this, and is very much in the news right now with pardons President Trump is handing down. Amnesty is the last one. So amnesty is a blanket pardon to all offenders of a specific crime. So this isn't saying that you specifically, I'm going to take away your sentence. It's anybody who has ever done this, whether you are convicted of it or have done it in the past, you can't get in trouble for it now. Benjamin Harrison, back in the 1880s, he granted amnesty for polygamists trying to gain favor with the Mormons out in the western states and to bring them into the Union. Jimmy Carter, President Carter, he granted amnesty for all draft dodgers. So this would have been anybody who during the Vietnam War ran to Canada, burned their draft card, any sort of way where they dodged the draft for the Vietnam War. Carter said, you can't get in trouble for that anymore. We are not going to pursue you for it. And if you were in trouble, that gets cleaned away. Now, if you dodge the draft now, there is no draft right now. But if you did, that wouldn't apply to you because that Carter amnesty was for those individuals for that specific set of crimes. All right, that's it. That's what I got for you. Make sure you do the check in this. And make sure you contact me with any questions. We're getting to the end of the marking period at this point. Both marking periods, first and second marking period, are both going to be graded as what you receive for the semester. If you have old work to do, do it. Do it soon. All right, bye.